We are learning several new revealing details this morning about what happened in the Trump White House before, during, and after the January 6th Capitol attack. The January 6th House Select Committee released a new trove of deposition transcripts from key witnesses late yesterday, including former head of personnel at the White House, John McEntee. He told the House panel former President Donald Trump wanted to issue blanket pardons for everyone who participated in the attack, saying, quote, "The president floated the idea and Pat Cipollone said no," referring to former White House counsel Pat Cipollone. McEntee continued, "I remember the president saying, well, what if I pardoned the people that weren't violent, that just walked into the building? And I think the White House counsel gave him some pushback on that," end quote. More newly released transcripts reveal former President Trump also considered firing any member of his staff who did not believe the 2020 election was stolen from him. Cipollone mentioned a memo that stated, quote, "Anybody that thinks there wasn't massive fraud in the 2020 election should be fired," end quote. Former White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson added this about that memo, telling the panel she addressed Cipollone about it, saying, quote, "Pat looked at it. He said something to the effect of, 'God, no.'" But Cipollone said he did not remember that interaction. What's more, former White House Communications Director Alyssa Farah Griffin spoke to the January 6th House panel on April 15th, describing her tenure at the Trump White House as, quote, "a wild 8 months." Griffin revealed one serious and ongoing problem was a lack of organization, to the surprise of no one. She described a Trump White House in which jobs were filled with underqualified staff because more senior government officials would not take positions within the administration. She said any report about the Trump White House being chaotic and operating without structure was, quote, "more or less accurate." That included there being no competent gatekeeper to stop harmful or unhelpful information from getting to then President Trump, which led to this moment in April of 2020 at the start of the COVID pandemic.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that.
The President of the United States in the middle of a pandemic. Griffin said she tried to stop Trump from making those now infamous remarks, but was blocked by Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who allowed for easy access and unchecked passage of bad materials, conspiracy theories, and anything else to make its way directly to the president. So, Gene Robinson, again, it's not particularly surprising to hear that it was a chaotic White House. We knew that. We've known that for several years. But to get these kind of firsthand accounts from what was happening in real time during a COVID pandemic, that crisis, and then, of course, around the 2020 election, and we'll get to more on this on the legal side of it, but the idea that Donald Trump dangled the concept of just giving a blanket pardon to anybody who came into the United States Capitol on January 6th, who attacked the United States Capitol on January 6th, could have repercussions for him down the road.
Yeah, I guess it could have repercussions for him. And, you know, where the prosecutors are always looking for his consciousness of guilt and his state of mind, his intent that day. And I think this perhaps speaks to that. He knew that there was legal jeopardy for those people and wanted to relieve that legal jeopardy. So it's, you know, none of this is really surprising, Willie, you know, in a sense, but it is shocking. And we should be shocked that the White House, this is the presidency of the United States of America, functioned in this shambolic, haphazard, crazy way for 4 years. And it just got worse and worse and worse until it culminated on January 6th. It's just amazing that we allowed this to happen. We, the people of the United States, allowed this to happen, and we must never allow anything like this to happen again. The national security of our nation and the world was was under the charge of these people who are in no way competent or sane to guard that security. It's just incredible.
And Reverend Al, we know that when Trump first became president, there was somewhat of an effort to have some adults surrounded him, particularly on the national security side, some grown-ups, some professionals. They all faded away during his 4 years in office, very few exceptions. And by the end there, in that period after the election, before January 6th, staffers left. There had been a COVID outbreak. I mean, there was no gatekeeper whatsoever. And that's how the Sidney Powells and Rudy Giuliani's of the world got through. But people have raised this idea to me, a worrisome one. We know that Donald Trump is running for president again. If somehow he were to be elected again, that's where he starts from. There will be no adults at all. There will be no gatekeepers at all. Only the true believers, only those, the incompetents who surrounded him at the end, they'd be there right from the start next time around.
You know, those of us that have dealt with Donald Trump and fought with him, dealt with him over the decades, realize Donald Trump, in effect, ran the White House the way he ran his business. Mm-hmm. There was no one that had a check or balance or even an advisory position in Trump Organization, which has come out in some of these investigations. He tried to run the White House like a one-man shop, and he did. And I think that is very concerning. I think it's very disturbing, and no adult would want to work in that kind of atmosphere. And if by chance he became president again, it can only get worse. I think that when we all stop in whatever form we do and count our blessings tomorrow night, thanking God for a year that we survived, we ought to thank God for the 4 years this country survived Donald Trump, because we don't know how close we were to disaster every day that man was sitting in the Oval Office.
I mean, not just close to disaster. We did lose over 1 million people to COVID that we didn't have to lose. But in the election, the question was in 2016, Donald Trump asked Black Americans, what do you have to lose? Everything, as it turns out, and not just
White
Black Americans.
Too, by the way.
That's what I'm saying, not just Black Americans. We lost a lot. The country is exhausted. I don't think anybody, including Republicans, wants to go back to having Donald Trump in the White House, because he's proven to be a loser for them in the elections that we just had at the midterms. And so, we'll see what happens. But I also just have to say, it's not just the chaos. I mean, of course, it's very easy to get focused on the incompetence, the chaos, the clownery that has been taking place, that did take place in Donald Trump's White House. But it's far more nefarious than that, because what you ultimately had was Donald Trump focused not on the American people, but only on him and what he could earn and take from the presidency and the American people. And those around him were focused on that goal as well. Nobody was doing the people's work. Nobody was protecting Americans from COVID, was looking out for our well-being, our economy, was really looking out for us at all. What was actually happening is they were looking out for themselves. So he was surrounded by grifters. He himself is a grifter. And that's far more nefarious than just people who are incompetent. I mean, maybe we should be grateful in some ways that they were so incompetent.
And Willie, what these transcripts do is paint a fuller picture of the Trump White House. The chaos, yes, but also what the committee really tried to do here is they show, there's an open door. These conspiracy theories could find Trump's desk, but he made the decision to act on them. And that is the roadmap they're now trying to give to the Department of Justice.
Yeah, it would have been nice to have a gatekeeper in Mark Meadows who kept some of those people outside the Oval Office. He didn't, but as you say, Donald Trump was going to find this garbage however he got his hands on it. Let's bring into the conversation former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. She's an MSNBC legal analyst. Joyce, good morning. It's good to see you. So as you watch these transcripts come out, as you hear this testimony directly from the room, from people who were there with Donald Trump, from Trump advisors during the pandemic and around the 2020 election and January 6th, what legal questions come to mind?
Well, the committee's job, Willie, as you all have been discussing, was political. They were engaged in oversight. They created a factual record, a narrative of what happened with just a magnificent report and set of transcripts. And the question now, and I'll put my prosecutor's hat on and say the question now is, what does DOJ do with it? And as we read the transcript, something that's very familiar emerges for prosecutors, because the transcripts, the narrative here, reads far less like oversight of a presidential administration. It has far less to do, for instance, with Hillary Clinton testifying for 11 hours about Benghazi than it has the appearance of the way an organized crime family operates. There is so much of an effort to keep the truth from coming to light. So much energy seems to be expended on that. There are so many people with terminal outbreaks of bad memory, people who can't remember details that just really seem startling. There are people who have legitimate loss of memory when they're witnesses, but typically people can recall events that occur around startling or strong events, like a president trying to overthrow an election after he's lost it. So now the challenge for DOJ is this: can they break through all of that obstruction? Will they be able to get to the truth and find prosecutable offenses based largely on this massive body of information that the committee has put together?